Joining me today is Moscow-based international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Today we're going to talk about the situation in and around Ukraine. Welcome, Mark. Maybe let's start out with an overview of what's going on the ground right now, and then we'll get into some of the major events.
Sure, Brian. First of all, thanks for having me on again. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on the new Atlas. I follow you and have followed you for years quite assiduously. And every time I'm checking something and writing up my analysis, I'm always scooting over to see what you're saying. So,
okay, thanks.
Right now, first of all, I think it's important to understand that there is always a certain level of conflict going along the entire length of the, de facto separation line between the Kiev regime and Russian forces in Ukraine all the time, right? Obviously, in the south, in the Kherson region, that conflict is now much reduced. Because of the Russian withdrawal from Kherson City, and putting the Dnieper between the Kiev regime and Russia. It doesn't mean that there's no conflict at all there, just that it's mostly static and diversionary. That there is still artillery shelling going on back and forth. The Kiev regime actually has a slight positional advantage. Because their bank of the Dnieper with Kherson City is actually higher, substantially higher than the other bank, which is why the flooding would have been particularly worse if they had blown up the Kakhovka reservoir dam. And that has resulted in Russia pulling back a few kilometers from the actual river and evacuating the towns there. And basically making that a gray zone because that takes them out of at least a substantial amount of the normal artillery and rocket system range of Kiev regime forces there. I don't expect any major operations there. To conduct a pontoon crossing would be extremely difficult. It is a wide river. Obviously, the Russian command, Surovikin, believed that it was too much to supply, probably not a defense, but I think he felt that it was probably too difficult to supply an offense and decided that he did not need the theater, and that kind of cold-blooded military calculus was made. Likewise, it's too difficult for the Kiev regime to launch an attack across the other side in any amount of real force. But there is a Spit Peninsula coming off that from the Nikolaev region, and they have made several forays to try to take that peninsula, but it doesn't really have much strategic value. And it's mostly diversionary to prevent Russia from pulling the majority of their forces away from that region, to try to keep as many tied down there as possible. Speaking of which, the Kiev regime is having a real problem with that because they moved some 30 to 40,000 troops south into the Kherson region, which actually, if you take a look at the transportation maps, has a relative paucity of railroad lines in the area compared to other, particularly, the east, and the area around Kiev in the country. And the principal reason, I mean, there are always multiple reasons, but the principal reason for Russia's strikes on the Kiev regime's electrical infrastructure has been to inhibit their military logistics and communications. And a lot of people may wonder how that is possible, but the mass movement of troops, of fuel, of ammunition, of military hardware, everything is done in this part of the world by trains because these are extremely vast distances. The roads aren't always of the best of repair, and roads, even when they're in the best of the repair, are not suitable for mass movement of tanks and anything in any part of the world. So everything has to be done by train. And that's why trains, control of train junctions and everything is such an important part of this war, because it is, everyone agrees that it is a war of logistics and attrition. And when you're fighting a war of logistics and attrition, then obviously the logistics matter. And Russia's strikes against the Kiev regime's electrical infrastructure are meant to inhibit this, because the majority of the trains in Ukraine are powered by electricity. You take out the electricity, you take out the ability of them to move their troops around the battlefield. And Russia has done exactly this. This is the purpose, the primary purpose that they're doing this. You can say that there is a secondary civilian morale and the like, but that's the primary reason. And that's exactly the same reason that the US gave when they were bombing the electrical infrastructure of Serbia to inhibit military logistics and communication. And then they're like, well, if there's a civilian morale problem, that's Milosevic's problem. That's exactly what the NATO Pentagon spokesman James Shea said at the time. So obviously Russia is following established military precedent by the arsenal of freedom and democracy when they're conducting the strikes, however much they might now try to paint it as a war crime now that Russia is doing it. But this is particularly inhibiting them in Kherson, because they're having a hard time moving their troops that they moved into that area out now. And of course, after Russia withdrew, there was essentially a race to move the troops that were there on either side to areas where they could now be used, because the Dnieper is such a significant geographic obstacle. So to Zaporozhye, to Donbass, to the northern Lugansk, somewhere where they could be used. And Russia has obviously won that particular. And some people are calling it a trap. I'm not so sure it's a trap, but certainly it was factored into the Russian command's strategic locations. And
one thing you mentioned that the East Bank is a gray zone. The West Bank is a bit of a gray zone. Also, Ukraine has not been able to establish.
They've evacuated the civil. They've ordered the civilian population that remained behind, right? Whether that is Kiev loyal or simply people that couldn't leave, they've evacuated it as well. And Russia is, of course, shelling the Kiev regime forces that are there, shelling them. So one of the arguments presented that Russia was going to save civilians and damage to Kherson by withdrawing. At the time, I was like, yeah, not so much, because I knew as soon as they withdrew that there was going to be artillery exchange back and forth. And actually, this will pretty much ensure over time the destruction of Kherson. That's the nature of this war, unfortunately. So the Kiev regime is having a hard time moving their troops out of there, and it appears that it was already about a week ago that Russia actually set a little trap. There was one primary railroad junction that was going to be used by the Kiev regime to move their forces out of Kherson, and that was hit by the Russians. That particular junction, which went a bit north of the Russian lines going forward into Zaporozhye, but they left a railroad junction to the south, closer to the Russian lines, unbombed. So the Kiev regime either had a option of bringing the movement of their troops on the rail lines closer to the Russian lines where they were more vulnerable, or then the only other way was to go all the way up around through Kiev. That was their options, and they chose the former, and they paid a price for it. And Russia artillery and airstrikes severely degraded a number of the Kiev regime troops as they were attempting to transit them out of the Kherson region, which shows at least that they're thinking, right? There's a lot of armchair quarterbacking, including by us, of course, of what the Russian military is doing, whether it's wise. I can't believe they're giving up Kherson, et cetera, et cetera. But you should not think that, they're not, playing the same game of 4D chess that the U.S. is when moving the Kiev regime forces around the battlefield. So there's some there. There is, in the Zaporozhye region, there is still the potential for a last-minute Kiev regime offensive for the year. They do have troops there. Russia all but also has significant amount of troops there, reinforced, of course, with what has been moved out of Kherson. And also the Russian artillery and aviation has done a pretty substantial job of degrading the Kiev regime forces there whenever they sought to gather, to collect together to push forward with an offensive. So I'm not convinced that a serious offensive. There may be something diversionary coming out of Zaporozhye. The primary Kiev regime offensive push at the moment continues to be in northern Lugansk, what is basically the remnants of the Kharkov offensive that then crossed the Oskol River and moved down into northern Lugansk. And they're trying to push forth into northern Lugansk, into a strategic small city, Svyatovo, which would be an important logistics node accomplishment if they manage to take it. So far, they've been substantially repulsed by what appear to be formidable Russian defenses. But the Kiev regime has built up a significant remains of what they have left for an armored fist in Kharkov. And there's only two basic places they could use it: to push forward north into actual mainland, Russia proper, Belgorod, which has little strategic value, but would be a very good PR propaganda victory, or towards Lugansk. And the other possibility there is Zaporozhye. And I still expect they will be attempting to make one final push before the new year, but their time is rapidly running out. And if they do so, expect to see if they can muster it together despite the inhibition of their logistics and the Russian strikes. Expect to see two smaller diversionary from two of those locations and one serious push. And I would suspect if there is a serious push, it will be in northern Lugansk towards Svyatovo, but increasingly it's looking like they may not be able to put it together by the new year. Meanwhile, the other major area of conflict is where Russia is on the offensive, and that is in the Bakhmut area, and a few weeks previously in the Ugledar area, both in Donetsk, one kind of like, you want to say, in the center of the second to last defensive line, where Wagner and the forces there have been slowly, ever so slowly, grinding through there for the last over 4 months now. But in the past couple of weeks, they've had a number of breakthroughs to the south, suburb settlements, and they've gone a long way in their efforts to surround the city, to cut off the supplies, which would pretty much necessitate its fall. And in the past week, Russia has, the Russian Ministry of Defense has put out that they have fire control over Bakhmut, which means that they can hit the two remaining roads that still are able to supply Bakhmut with their artillery. And that is a serious challenge. The other main area I would say that Russia made a push in the last few weeks is kind of unexpectedly in southern Donetsk up towards Ugledar, where they made some good movements. But they then kind of exhausted their push, and the Kiev regime has moved. I mean, they've been continually doing this, throwing more and more reinforcements into Bakhmut and then into Ugledar. And because of that, Ugledar has, I think, turned static again for the moment. The Russian forces there need time for rotation and rejuvenation. They might push further later. But in Bakhmut, it's a different story, and neither side is backing down at all. And both sides continue to throw reinforcements. And I'm sure, Brian, you have seen the Verdun-like pictures that have emerged, particularly out of the Kiev regime forces trenches there with the heavy rains. It's been a very cold, wet November, and the conditions that both sides, I'm sure, but we've seen particularly from the Kiev regime of the state of the trenches there, the filth that they live in, and the fact that it is a trench artillery and fortification war there. It just evokes so many, not exactly pleasant memories of World War I, but that's really what's going on there. But the condition where Kiev keeps throwing reinforcements and reinforcements and reinforcements into Bakhmut, actually, Russia is not, I think the Russian military is not of a mind that they need to hurry there, because the meat grinder works very well for their goal of demilitarization. If the Kiev regime keeps bringing the troops to them, and they have what they believe to be a killing box, and the Kiev regime's presidential advisor, Alexei Arestovich, this Goebbels-like figure who's referred to as Zelensky's brain, he himself has noted out that Russia has at least a 9-to-1 artillery advantage in there, in what everyone agrees is an artillery war, which means almost certainly that the kill ratio is very high on the Russian side. And as long as they're enjoying a high kill ratio and still advancing forward, even if it's only 100 meters a day, another block or so, that plays to their advantage, because they're grinding through the Kiev regime's military, which is one of their most important goals. And of course, that for those concerned about loss of life on the Ukrainian side, which, having substantial family in Ukraine, as much as I want to see the regime defeated, I do not enjoy the loss of Ukrainian life, particularly of conscripts who don't necessarily want to be there, particularly from the eastern part of the country, but find themselves with little choice. And indeed, we've seen just in the past couple days video out on the Telegram channels where a Russian drone observed some Kiev regime troops taking a few of their comrades into the woods and shooting them. And we can probably assume that they were defying orders or deserters of some kind. And when you wonder how they keep their forces fighting when not everyone in the country, particularly in the East, has ever loved the regime that seized power in 2014. Things like that, the use of blocking units, the use of these Banderite fascist neo-Nazis peppered throughout military units effectively as ideological commissars. That's how they do it. That is how they have been accomplishing it. And they've been doing fairly well, all things considered. So that needs to be recognized. But it's obvious that Russia.
You mentioned demilitarization, and this is a point that I try to bring up also. The Western media says, look at Russia, look how little progress they're making because they're obsessed with lines on a map. You're describing a situation where the Ukrainian military is basically being fed into Russian defenses, and it's disappearing. Men and equipment, heavy weapons, ammunition, all being expended. And then we're also hearing from the Western media, maybe you could expand on this, the Western media admitting, the CEO of Raytheon admitting they've gone through years and years worth of stockpiles in just 10 months, and it's going to take years to replace it. So this is the game plan that Russia has laid out, this consuming demilitarization, just as Russian President Vladimir Putin said from the very beginning. So maybe can you expand on that, what we're seeing on the ground, what we're hearing from the Western media regarding arms and ammunition?
Yeah, I think that's where you and I are like exactly on the same page, that we've been following, that this issue of logistics is crucial to what we both, I think, still see as Russia's primary military advantage in the type of war that is being waged. This is the type of war that Russia wanted. This is why they gave up territory in Kherson and Kharkov where the Kiev regime was able to use their manpower advantage against thinly stretched out Russian forces that the Russian SMO was never originally envisioned, however right or wrong, and I think it was wrong, but to take large amounts of territory and hold it. And the South pretty much ended up in Russia's lap as a result of their initial attempted thunder runs and decapitation strike while Kiev remained outside it. It worked very well in the South, where there was actually very little fighting, and most of the Kiev regime forces just stood down. And a number of the officials there were obviously cut deals with the Russian intelligence services and were secreted out of the area with their families safely because they were never predisposed towards the regime in Kiev to begin with. So that was all done, with relatively little fighting, and it was successful in the beginning. But this is the type of war that Russia wants to fight now, right? Where the Kiev regime is back to feeding their forces into a Russian offensive meat grinder, where they have their artillery, their airstrikes concentrated, where their logistics lines are extremely firm. In fact, it's much easier for Russia to get forces there than it is for the Kiev regime, which has to bring everything from Europe all the way across Ukraine to get it into the front in the Donbass. So Russia's quite actually happy to make incremental progress in Bakhmut while grinding through the Kiev regime military with a very high kill ratio. And a lot of people don't understand that. And it's extremely frustrating at times when you have to deal with the Western mainstream media headlines and all of these militarily ignorant pundits cheering on Ukrainian victory. It can get frustrating. And a lot of people resort to dooming and glooming and blackpilling about it. But if I could, Brian, you've seen the same articles I have over the last week. Financial Times, military briefing, Ukraine war exposes hard reality of West's weapons capacity, which the hard reality is they don't have the ammunition. They don't have particularly the artillery shells. They don't have the HIMARS ammunition. They don't have more artillery pieces to throw at them. That is the hard reality. The same thing we saw in Politico just in the last couple days. We haven't got this figured out just yet. Pentagon industries struggle to arm Ukraine. And they're talking basically about, a lot of it is about artillery. This is an artillery war. It's not just artillery, but that's, if you take a look at that, is the biggest issue. And if you follow that, you can understand how that lends on to everything else. It's an artillery war. Russia has a huge artillery advantage. A piece by Rusi, an extensive piece examining it, points it out that Ukraine started out this conflict with a very substantial amount of artillery, where such that the Russian force arrayed against them for the SMO only had a 2-to-1 advantage to start things out. And they've pointed out that is now at a 12-to-1 advantage. And why is that at a 12-to-1 advantage? Because Russian artillery and their air forces have wiped out all the rest of the Ukrainian artillery, and all they have left in terms of both artillery pieces and the ammunition is the trickle of pieces that they've gotten from the West. And a 150 M777s, which have already, at least half of them have already gone the way of the Soviet legacy artillery pieces, is just not enough in that particular situation, except to draw the agony out.
Yeah.
And we've heard since June about the amount of ammunition that is being expended in this conflict, and we heard it from Kiev regime officials themselves. And if anything, it has only increased since then as the intensities of the battles, particularly in Bakhmut and so forth, have picked up. And that was that the Kiev regime is firing 5,000 to 6,000 shells a day, and that the Russian side is expending 50,000 to 60,000 shells a day. And when you hear the ridiculous propaganda come out of the Kiev regime about, oh, massive Russian casualties and how they're suffering no casualties on their side, and this is repeated stenography wise by the Western media that, you know, never ever questions anything that Zelensky says, because, you know, that's the role they have adopted, the Baghdad Bobs, if you will, of this conflict. How, if the other side in an artillery war has a 10-to-1 advantage in both artillery pieces and ammunition expended, does the Kiev regime have a higher kill ratio on the battlefield? It doesn't, right? It's that simple.
Exactly.
That's just
No.
absurd propaganda. And, you know, it's not admitted in the media, but if you listen to the military statements, you can see when they're trying not to say certain things and putting things between the lines, something that you do when you dissect their briefings. So I don't know how you can put up with it so much to go line by line and point out where they're lying or simply not stating the truth or so forth. But that one of the things that's come out in the recent weeks is it was always assumed, first of all, that the Russian economy would collapse. And quite obviously that didn't happen. Not at all, right? The Russian economy was originally predicted at the start of the conflict to be facing a 25 to 30% drop in GDP for the year. And they're now saying, well, it's going to be actually somewhere between 2 and 4%. And while that is true for the economy overall, actually the Kremlin coffers, right, the government budget is flush because of the increased price of oil and gasoline, which is either state industries or the ones that are in private hands have heavy windfall taxes on them. So the Kremlin is actually flush with money. They've actually built up the reserves, that half of which were stolen when their reserves were frozen by the West in the beginning of the conflict. They've been feeding back into their reserves over the last 9 months because they've had so much money coming in, and they've almost built back up to that $600-700 billion level. It's just not in dollars and euros anymore, which, to be frank, it never should have been in the first place. And some people in the Ministry of Finance should have lost more than their jobs over that, but you know, that's another story. So what the West is not geared for this type of war, and they've slowly in these articles and a dozen or so before it that we've both, I think, talked about, they've been admitting it. Their military industrial complex was geared up for the last couple decades for high-tech boondoggles, like the F-35, like this B-21 Doolittle, Raider.
Yeah.
Which maybe it's a good stealth aircraft. We don't know because it's never even flown yet. But it's simply stealth is obsolete with modern air defense systems, particularly that possessed by Russia and China, which uses Russian air defenses. So the thing is kind of pointless, and I think you've pointed that out as well. The other thing they were geared up for is, you know, low intensity counterinsurgency struggle in third world countries that were not near peer competitors, that were, you know, running around with AK-47s in deserts, and that's all they had to deal with. So that's what their military industrial complex has been geared up for. And they just seem to realize that. They have not stockpiled ammunition. They've been operating on a idea that they could produce on demand what they needed, which was completely false. And now the industry people from Raytheon and from these other companies, they're all admitting to the Western media now that actually, you know, we don't have the ability to just turn production back on after, you know, decades since the end of the Cold War, where we have not stockpiled these unsexy basic things like artillery shells and ammunition and the like. Not only, can they not do it, but because they are driven by the profit motive. This is not a wartime economy for them. The U.S. hasn't declared war. They haven't nationalized businesses. This is not a World War II type situation. They have to provide enough incentive to these companies to completely restart production lines, hire new, buy out new factories, new equipment, hire mass numbers of new people to do this. And they can only do that if they are promised long-term contracts of supply, which the government, the European governments are all like, yes, we need to build it all. And then like when it comes down to actually doing it, no, that's too expensive. We'll put it off and make a decision next year sometime. So obviously that's not happening. And even in the U.S., the amount of long-term, contracts needed to supply these things is still, it's still being talked about. It's not being done largely. And even once those contracts are signed, it will take years. And we heard from Raytheon just this week in Politico that they current U.S. artillery production is 30,000 155 millimeter shells a year. That is the amount that the Kiev regime is going through in less than a week. And that is half the amount that Russia is expending a day. Right? And they expect to bump that up to 20,000 shells a month by spring. That is 4 days supply. And what are they going to do for the other 26 days of the month?
Yeah.
By 2025, they expect to have that number up to 40,000 artillery shells a month, which is still less than Russia is expending a day. Meanwhile, Russia not only has their stockpiles, their Soviet stockpiles of this type of shells, which were enormous because they were preparing for exactly this type of war, but they also have the productive capacity to do this because that is what their military industrial complex is still aligned to produce. So the war that is being fought is on the terms that Russia wants to fight it. So in effect, they are demilitarizing not just the Kiev regime at this point. To a very real and substantial extent, they are demilitarizing NATO. We have heard from the British that Russia is expending an amount of shells in 2 days in June that was larger than the entirety of British artillery stockpiles in the whole country for the entire military, everything.
Yeah.
Those were the two big heavy hitters. That's the US and the UK. And after that, everything else is downhill from there. And we have heard that a majority of NATO countries, as reported by New York Times almost 2 weeks ago, have nothing left to give. And they said it's really only France, Italy, and Germany and the US that have the capacity to give more. And then in the next few days, France said, we tap out. We don't have anything else either. And obviously the British don't either. Hence their announcement that they're going to focus more on training than supplying. And the U.S. military industrial complex is not able to get up to speed for lack of contracts and long-term profits. And even once they are, it's still years and years down the road, and it will still not be enough. So that is where this is heading. So, I mean, the West is often referred to as the Kiev regime's strategic depth, right? They can't produce anything in their country anymore because Russia has bombed their entire military industry. They can't stage anything. They can't build anything. Everything has to be done in the West. The West is their strategic depth. But their strategic depth has just run dry. And as long as the Russian government has the political will to see through this, next year is going to be very, very hard for the Kiev regime military because the 100,000 shells that the U.S. has been trying to scrape out of South Korea on the other side of the world to provide for the Kiev regime. I haven't even heard that deal has been finalized, because the South Koreans know very well that if they did that, Russia would suddenly seem fit to supply North Korea with something else that North Korea wants on their shopping list, which would make their situation more difficult. And that's, not even considering, the energy that South Korea needs from Russia. So it's not sexy. It's not a victory that is going to happen overnight. In many ways, it's a more classic Russian-style victory as they fought in World War II. They've made a lot of stupid mistakes on the battlefield. The envisioning of the SMO in the beginning, I think there was a lot of problems with their belief about the Kiev regime's ability to get its troops to fight for it, about the level of political insurgency in Ukraine, which was obviously compromised. And they also, I think, did not quite expect the level of Western support that Kiev has gotten. But regardless of that, the path to a Russian complete victory is still there. With the reinforcements, there's 380,000 reservists that have been called up and volunteers that have yet to be injected onto the battlefield. And that is more than double what the Russian SMO has been from the beginning, to give you an idea of the scale. What does the Kiev regime have to answer to that when the manpower advantage that they had is returned to near parity, and they are completely the West that has been basically fueling their second army, because the first one has already been destroyed. That one has now been exhausted as well, because the West does not have the industrial capacity to wage this type of war here and now.
And you were mentioning the British training. When you look at the actual training program, it's abbreviated, so it's substandard training, and the quantity of troops going through this training process don't even come close to replacing what Ukraine is losing, let alone exceeding it. So this is a problem across many aspects, and it's not just the technical inability of the West to expand industrial output. It is structural. I think you were talking about Russia. Its defense industry is nationalized. They make what the government tells them to make. In the West, is totally different. It's profit-driven, not purpose-driven. This is at the root of it, and this is something they're not going to be able to get it done. Even if they could, it'll take years, but that's a big if, I think. Now, you were talking about strategic depth, and we've seen, and you also talked about these PR things that Ukraine depends on, because it cannot make anything of substance happen on the battlefield. So we heard about Russia gearing up for this massive missile strike that we just saw, again, striking Ukraine's infrastructure. And then there were supposedly these Soviet-era Tupolev jet drones that hit two airfields quite deep inside Russia, but the damage was minimum. And this is not something that Ukraine can do often or enough to make any difference. And it was meant to disrupt this missile strike, and it really didn't. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. This is, the Kiev regime has already done this once before. They did it in Kursk a couple of months ago without a huge result. I think they also managed to destroy a fuel storage unit there, and the rest were shot down. And destroying a fuel storage unit for Russia, it's inconvenient. It can slow things down, but Russia quite obviously has the fuel to recover from things like that. Whereas Russia's doing this on a daily basis to the fuel that Ukraine is getting from the West, because that's the only source they have. And the West is running out of energy themselves, to even power their own cities. With France telling their people to expect blackouts this winter, and the UK doing so as well, and so forth. So that was not significant. But what it appears that the Kiev regime has done, they don't have a long strike capacity, right? The HIMARS supposedly gave them a larger strike capacity than anything they had left. At the beginning of the conflict, they did, but it was quickly taken out, right? So the HIMARS, with about 100 miles, was the 50 kilometers actually, perhaps a little less than that. That was the farthest, the deepest strike capacity they had. So what they came up with is they had a number of old Soviet drones from the 1970s that were produced there. And they were essentially museum pieces. And this is the two, it's not quite clear whether, so far I've heard contradictory reports, whether it's a 141 Strij or a 143 Regis, but one of the two. And they have heavily modified and refurbished it basically into a cruise missile, right? Not incredibly accurate, but having substantial range. And they sent two of these in the last 48 hours into Russia. They were probably fired from the Kharkov region, which is closest there. And they were one of them was able to travel about 500 kilometers to Ryazan, and the other one even further, about 700 kilometers to Engels, to hit Russian strategic bomber airfields. Now, they could have only known that these airfields were vulnerable with satellite data. Now, what I've heard so far is that Russia is saying that a private Western company, Maxara, is responsible for this, which, as far as I'm concerned, makes their satellites fair targets, not being a state satellites, much like Russia should be shooting Starlink down out of the sky. Fortunately, there's so many of them and they're so small, it makes it unpractical. I don't know about the Maxara satellites, but regardless, whether it's from a private company or the state, the Ukraine would not have the ability to know that these airfields were vulnerable, and they were vulnerable. Quite obviously, we can see from the satellite, the Google Maps and everything that we can now analyze. We can see that they had a number of strategic bombers just out on the airfield without protective berms between them, and the like. And that was a ridiculous mistake. And they have been lulled by a belief that the Kiev regime has a limited long-range strike capacity. And they do have a limited, but they do appear to have a minimum amount. Now, even at the end of the Soviet era, the Ukraine only had about 150 of those things. And that number has almost certainly gone down substantially since that time. But obviously, they have some of them, and it appears the attempt was repeated just today with another strike in Kursk that hit another fuel storage location. No big thing, no casualties. Now, the end result, the damage that has been confirmed that I've seen, is that only one bomber received some damage to a tail wing. And that was the only real damage that I saw. But it's not so much the damage that was inflicted, of course. It is the PR value of being able to show that Kiev can still make strikes and that they can make these long-range strikes. And, of course, it can't be ignored in the Russian press that if they can hit Ryazan and Engels, well, they can certainly hit Moscow, because that falls right in the middle of the range of those two. So the alarm bells in the media, Russian media, immediately went off. Oh my God, they could hit Moscow. And, that is something that the Russian people, still the war is still very much at a remove from them because they haven't suffered very much from it. Inflation has been very moderate here, with only 300,000 reservists called up in a country of 148 million. It still hasn't really touched Russians' lives, much in the same way that when America fought the Gulf War and the Iraq War, that it didn't touch most Americans' lives. It's something they read about in the news, they had opinions about, but it's not something that affects every Russian family, like a war. And the fact that Russia is fighting de facto all of NATO at this point, I think they really need to come to that realization. So maybe, the propaganda value aside, it is not such a bad thing that is being shown to them, because there is always the possibility that the West could provide longer range systems to them. Now, just at the same time, we've heard a leak to the Western press at exactly the same time that the U.S. leaked that the HIMARS systems that they provided to Ukraine were specifically modified, restricted, that they could not be used, the supposedly hardware and software, that even if the U.S. was to send ATACMS, they could not be used from the HIMARS, something that the Western media has been talking about. Why don't you give them the ATACMS? Why don't you give them the ATACMS? And now they're supposedly admitting that they could never provide them anyway because they would be useless, because the HIMARS they've received couldn't fire them anyway. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know whether the Russian government believes it's true, but the timing cannot be ignored. This is clearly the U.S. signaling to Russia that we had nothing to do with these Soviet drone strikes deep in Russia, and we are not providing the Kiev regime with long-term strike capacity. The timing of the leak could only have been specifically to signal that. Now, I myself am like, if this data was provided to them, I don't believe that the U.S. didn't know about it, but at least they are signaling that this wasn't actively us, which I think is important. And I simply find the fact that they were so desperate to leak that to the press as a message to Russia is noteworthy. The Russian strikes that occurred, within 12 hours afterwards, these were obviously already intended. They're not retaliatory strikes. This was the next round of strikes. And the Kiev regime says that some 70 strikes were launched, and they shot down 80 of them or something of the sort. And only 10 strikes were hit and 40 facilities were destroyed. And, the usual propaganda lines you hear out of that. But if you're paying attention, the strikes last night, while they did target the electrical infrastructure, the effects of that were not as immediately obvious as the last salvo, in that the entire country was not blocked out. Parts of it were. And there's a reason for that. And that's what the Russian military experts are now saying, is that actually only about half of these strikes, maybe even less than that, were actually at electrical infrastructure this time. That instead, a substantial part of the strikes was actually at industrial capacity and at military targets. It seems that in November, Russia put a number of new military satellites into orbit that were intended to give Russia the same essential Starlink capacity and satellite capacity that they have actually been lacking. It turns up that their satellites weren't actually much, the satellites they already had in orbit weren't actually arranged to give a very consistent battlefield image of Ukraine, because it was not, something that a decade or 2 decades ago they were really envisioning doing. And they have had demonstrative to them the utility of having troops being able to connect to military internet networks and the like, the way the Ukrainians have been able to do with Starlink. The consensus is that Russia started making these strikes against military targets because it suddenly became, they suddenly had much more intelligence available to do this, to make those strikes count, right? You're going to fire a cruise missile, you better make sure at a conventional target that it is a significant enough agglomeration to make it worth it. The other thing is they targeted, in particular, we know about a couple of industrial sites. One in Zaporozhye, they hit a factory that was making transformer equipment, which will further inhibit the Kiev regime's ability to repair further damage from further electrical strikes. And the other one hit in Kryvyi Rog, a metallurgical plant that was being used to do repairs and work on diesel-powered locomotives. And less than a third of the Ukraine's locomotives were powered by diesel. As we already talked, the majority of them were electricity. They did have a limited number of older diesel engines, really old, some of them dating back to like the 1930s, that they still had. And in the last few months, they've been using them more for civilian purposes. But as Russia opened up the attacks on the Ukraine's electrical infrastructure, they're being distributed and used for military purposes to make up at least some fraction of logistical capability when Russia periodically brings the logistical networks down by strikes on these substation transformers and like. And it needs to be pointed out, Kiev regime electrical officials have spoken about this to the Western press, and I highlighted in one of my recent things, that Russia is actually not targeting the Kiev regime's ability to produce electrical power. They're hitting distributive nodes, substation, transformers, switchgear, and the like. So they're not actually aiming to do permanent damage. They're aiming to connect. They're destroying their ability to distribute that power around the country, and eventually, the Kiev regime will run out of the repair parts capable of connecting it, but still leaving open the possibility once Russia moves into areas or the conflict is over to repair everything. And again, that is showing the almost too substantial Russian level of concern for serious damage to their neighbor that they have taken since the beginning of the conflict. But there is, of course, a problem even with the diesel-powered locomotives. And Russia has just done more damage to their ability to repair them and keep them on the tracks. But the fact that they run on diesel, and emergency electrical generators run on diesel, and tanks and other military hardware run on diesel. And the Kiev regime already has a diesel shortfall because they get everything from the West, and the West is running low on diesel. And you see another logistical limitation here, which is playing ever slowly to the Russian side. So there have been, there was some noise that, the Kiev just shrugged off this latest salvo because it wasn't all targeted on bringing down power around the country. It was more varied in this particular situation, but it is all very strategic strikes that are meant to inhibit long-term the Kiev regime's logistical capacity in multiple areas, and it will make them harder for them to recover from the next salvo and so forth. So I think it's important to usually give these things a few hours time after they initially happen before running onto Twitter and the like, making prejudgments about it and letting the dust settle and see what was actually hit.
So when does Russia run out of missiles? Because I was told in April they ran out, and then I was told again last month that they would run out. And after the last, not this one, but the one before it, that had to be it, because there's no way they just launched 100 missiles. There's no way they have more missiles, and they just carried out another full salvo against these targets that you're describing. Between that and the Garan 2, the Garan 2 is what happened to it. Maybe we could get your thoughts on these two issues.
Yeah. So quite obviously, this was the very last missiles that Russia has, and they will no longer be able to fire anything. I'm sure the Institute for the Study of War will come out with exactly that in the next thing. All right. So let's be clear. Obviously, Russia has fired already far more missiles than the West believed they had in their stockpiles, right? And even if we make the assumption that Russia had more than twice as many of cruise missiles in their stockpiles than the West said they would, that they've already essentially exhausted that as well. So what is that left is that Russia's productive capacity for producing these cruise missiles is far more substantial than the West believed it was. Their sanctions have not had an effect to inhibit that, certainly not yet. And that Russia is still obviously producing upwards of 100 cruise missiles a month now to be able to continue these strikes, maybe twice that. If they're firing 100 cruise missiles or more every 2 weeks, right, which is what we've seen. So it's down to productive capacity. And they keep that number much tighter than the West does. And I think Western analysts, have made clear that they don't know that number. And we don't know that number on the ground here, but we can see the effects when they're fired every 2 weeks, and that is continuing. So, and that is going obviously to continue into the future, because there's no, unlike the Kiev regime, whose productive capacity for war has been taken away, Russia's has not. So that will continue. With the Garan 2, quite obviously, Russia is calculating what to do with them. They have all indications. Even the West has admitted now that actually Russia has built factories to produce them. And quite obviously, there has been a slowdown in Garan 2 swarms in the past few weeks. So that tells us that they are producing them and stockpiling them for what we can only assume is going to be a big shock and awe style attack sometime in the future, probably using them to overwhelm artillery positions, air defenses, and the like, which I will presume is going to be in conjunction with a presumed big winter offensive, bringing in the 300 to, whatever it is. The Institute of War says 500,000, says 500,000. I'll go with that. That is going to be launched, and we don't know exactly where it's going to be launched. I don't think it makes much sense at this point to throw more troops into the Donbass. And it doesn't make sense to throw large numbers of more troops into territory in Kherson and Kharkov that Russia has already strategically made the decision to withdraw from, as is not meeting the overall, purposes of their war, with their aversion to casualties and the like. That leaves, either cutting off the flow of Western arms to eastern Ukraine, either at the Dnieper or along the Polish border. Both of those would mean having to take large amounts of territory, and particularly in Poland, there's a lot of potential there for things escalating out of hand with Poland or something else there. So I think that pretty much leaves that Russia is gearing up their big winter offensive for a big, massive strike through Belarus on Kiev, and not 30,000 troops, like was used before with this decapitation strike, Thunder Run. No, and an actual a number of troops, more than probably upwards of 200,000. That will make a serious attempt to at least put Kiev under siege, and to take out the nearby cities that would, like Zhytomyr and Chernigov, that would be necessary to do that. That's if you have that many more troops to use, you want to end this in one fell swoop, or at least end a substantial amount of it, which means going for Kiev. It doesn't mean that they won't set up a shadow government in Lvov or Poland or somewhere, and that will be the end of the conflict. No, but it will be a substantial pivot point in the conflict. That's what I see. And that's what I see them building up these Garan numbers for. And there's talk, and I consider it very credible and substantial talk, that Russia has also gotten other drone models, more advanced drone models from Iran too, like the Arash, and that they will be using those as well. And again, it's not so much that they've gotten huge amounts of drones sent across the Caspian in ships. It's that Iran has given them the ability to domestically produce them, where they can easily change out the guidance systems to use GLONASS and the like to make it more effective and for their use on the battlefield. And that's what's going on. And the Western press has only recently admitted that was the case, that it was actually the design and the rights to produce them that Iran provided, and not just some limited number of drones and some one-off sale.
Which means the sanctions on Iran to stop them from sending drones that they weren't actually sending them is just empty. It's just hot air, as usual.
In reality, it was obviously a color revolution attempt that was intended to punish them for providing these drone designs.
Yes.
But much like China, Iran also knows that if NATO defeated Russia, that would very much bring them knocking on their own door as well.
Yes.
And despite all the political and cultural and historical differences between Russia and China and Iran and a number of other countries, they all realize that they have to have each other's back at this time. And that if one of them goes down, probably the other two will as well.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for answering my question as to where this was all going next. We've reached an hour. I want to really thank you for taking the time to lay out all of this. This was a quite thorough examination of the situation right now in and around Ukraine. Can you just tell people where they can find and follow your work?
Sure. First of all, on Twitter and Telegram, right? I'm on Twitter at Mark Sleboda 1. I still post a lot there. I haven't been taken down yet. I'm sure it's only a matter of time, whether Elon Musk or not. But if that falls through, I am on Telegram as well. I guess I still have a Facebook account if anyone still follows Facebook. But I am on Sputnik's radio shows, particularly the Critical Hour and Fault Lines, but also Political Misfits, all of them, several, usually 6 or 7 times a week. You can find me there, and I try to post at least some of those on my Substack as well. I have a Substack where I put my radio interviews as well as some article pieces, and my YouTube channel, which is still in the nascent stages, nothing compared to the New Atlas, but The Real Politique, Real Politique with Mark Sleboda, technically, and you can find a number of stuff I do there, the short video pieces as well.
Okay, and I'm going to put the links to all of that in the video description below, as well as a pinned comment at the top of the comment section. Thank you again, and we hope to have you back here real soon.
I just want to say to all of those people out there in my comments who are saying, you say this, but Brian says that. Just so you guys know, we talk several times a week. We chat all the time about things. So we're always sharing information and our own assessments of what's going on. So you don't need to tell us that the other person said this or that. We all know.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mark, and I hope to see you soon.
Great. Thanks, Brent.